The invitation arrived on cream cardstock with gold lettering, the kind of stationery Callum Ashford had always favored, because he believed, correctly, that it made everything he touched look more expensive than it actually was. And Nadia Reyes turned it over twice in her hands before she let herself read past the first line. You are cordially invited to celebrate the engagement of Callum Ashford and Priscilla Wade. 3 years since the divorce, and he still hadn't lost the instinct to invite the person he'd hurt to witness exactly how well he was doing without her. She knew what this was. She'd known the moment the envelope arrived at her old office address, forwarded twice before it found her, because Callum had never once done anything without calculating the angle first, and inviting his ex-wife to his engagement party wasn't an oversight. It was a message, carefully wrapped in etiquette, designed to be delivered in front of a room full of people who'd watched their marriage end in a blaze of accusations 3 years ago. Most of them believing, because Callum had made very sure they believed it, that Nadia had left him for reasons that made her look considerably worse than the truth actually was. "You're not seriously considering going," said her sister Dana, sprawled across Nadia's kitchen counter with the invitation held at arm's length like it might be contagious. "He humiliated you in front of half this city when you two split. He told people you'd had an affair. He told people you were unstable. And now he wants you to show up and toast his happiness like none of that happened?" "I'm considering it," Nadia said, "because I think it's time he learned exactly how badly he miscalculated." She hadn't told Dana the full extent of what the last 3 years had actually looked like, mostly because Dana had been busy with her own life, and Nadia had never been one to advertise her recoveries the way Callum advertised his victories. When the marriage ended, Callum had kept the house, the car, the friends who'd always liked him better, and the version of the story that painted Nadia as the villain. And Nadia had kept 2 4-year-old twins, a savings account with considerably less in it than she'd expected, and a stubborn refusal to let any of it define what came next. She'd taken a small consulting contract with a boutique investment firm that had, improbably, turned into a full-time position. And the full-time position had turned into a partnership, and the partnership had turned into the kind of career Callum had once told her. During one of their worst arguments, she didn't have the ambition to build without him funding it. The first year had been the hardest, a blur of daycare pickups and freelance invoices and nights spent at the kitchen table long after the twins were asleep, running numbers on a laptop that had crashed twice and cost more to fix than she could comfortably afford. She remembered, with a clarity that still stung faintly even now, the specific humiliation of running into one of Callum's old business partners at the grocery store during that first year, dressed in clothes she'd worn to exhaustion, and the way his eyes had flicked over her with a pity she hadn't asked for and didn't want. She'd gone home that night and cried in the shower so the twins wouldn't hear her, and then, the next morning, had gone into the office an hour early and closed the deal that would eventually become the foundation of her partnership. She didn't tell that story often. She didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves now, in ways that made the memory feel less like a wound and more like a marker of exactly how far she'd come. The twins, Leo and Sienna, were 7 now, sharp and funny, and entirely unbothered by the absence of a father who called on birthdays and little else. And it was mostly for their sake that Nadia had decided, reading the invitation a second time at her kitchen table, that she would in fact attend Callum's engagement party, though not remotely for the reasons he'd probably imagined when he'd added her name to the guest list. The other part of her decision had a name, and the name was Theodore Marsh, though most of the city simply called him Theo, in the particular way people default to first names for men powerful enough that surnames feel unnecessary. She'd met him 8 months earlier at a fundraiser her firm had helped organize, a chance conversation about a poorly structured portfolio that had turned over the following weeks into dinners and long phone calls and the slow, careful unfurling of two people who'd both been burned badly enough by previous relationships that neither of them rushed anything. He wasn't the reason she'd built her career back from nothing, and she was careful, always, to keep that distinction clear in her own head. But he was, undeniably, part of the life she'd built since Callum had made very sure she'd have to build one. "You want me to come to your ex-husband's engagement party," Theo said, when she finally worked up the nerve to ask him. Sitting across from her at the small kitchen table Leo and Sienna had colored on more times than the wood grain probably deserved. As what, exactly? Moral support? As whatever you want to be introduced as, Nadia said. "I'm not asking you to perform anything. I just think it's time Callum sees exactly how thoroughly his version of events didn't hold up." Theo considered this for a long moment, the particular stillness of a man who'd built an empire out of careful, unhurried decisions. "I have one condition." "What's that?" "The twins come too, if they're willing. I'd like to actually meet the people whose photographs have been on your fridge since the week I met you, and I think there's something considerably more satisfying about your ex-husband seeing exactly who those children have grown into, rather than hearing about it secondhand." The night of the engagement party arrived cold and clear. The venue, a rooftop space downtown that Callum had clearly chosen for the view of the skyline behind him, strings of warm lights threaded between the potted olive trees and a jazz trio playing something low and unobtrusive near the bar. The kind of setting designed to be photographed from a dozen flattering angles. Nadia had spent longer than she'd admit choosing her own dress, not out of vanity, she told herself, but because she understood exactly how a room like this one worked, how quickly appearances got recalculated the moment someone new walked through the door. And she'd wanted, for once, to walk into a room built by Callum's careful curation and not feel like the least polished thing in it. She stood in the elevator with Leo's hand in one of hers, and Sienna's in the other, Theo a steady, quiet presence just behind them, and felt none of the dread she'd expected walking into a room that had once watched her marriage collapse in real time. The reaction, when they stepped out onto the rooftop, arrived in stages, the way a stone dropped into still water sends ripples outward long after the splash itself has faded. First came the recognition, a ripple of turned heads near the bar, the particular hush of people realizing the ex-wife had actually shown up, which was, in itself, more than Callum had probably expected. Then came the twins, 7 years old and unmistakably his in the shape of their eyes, dressed sharply and behaving with an easy confidence that drew attention the moment they crossed the room. And Nadia watched more than a few guests do visible arithmetic, remembering a divorce 3 years old and 2 small children they'd half forgotten existed. And then, last, came Theo, and the ripple became something considerably larger, because there wasn't a person on that rooftop who didn't recognize Theodore Marsh, whose name had been on 3 separate acquisitions in the business section that year alone, standing there with his hand resting lightly at the small of Nadia's back, like he'd been standing there for years. Callum found them within minutes, moving through the crowd with the particular urgency of a man whose evening had just taken a sharp and unwelcome turn, Priscilla trailing a step behind him in a dress that had clearly been chosen to be the most photographed thing in the room, and was, currently, losing that competition badly. "Nadia," Callum said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "I didn't think you'd actually come. You invited me," Nadia said simply. It seemed rude not to. "And you brought." His gaze flicked toward the twins, then toward Theo, and something in his expression faltered in a way Nadia had waited 3 years to witness. "Leo, Sienna, look at you both." "Hi, Dad," Sienna said, with the flat, unimpressed tone of a 7-year-old who had learned, somewhere along the way, that her father's attention arrived in inconsistent doses and had stopped rearranging her expectations around it. Leo said nothing at all, simply studied his father with the frank, appraising look of a child sizing up a stranger at a party, which struck Nadia as considerably more devastating than anything either of them could have said. "And you must be," Colum said, turning to Theo with the particular brightness of a man trying very hard to recover ground he'd already lost. "Miss Marsh, I read about the Kessler acquisition. Impressive work." "Thank you," Theo said, with the pleasant, unbothered ease of a man who had clearly weathered considerably more pointed conversations than this one. "Nadia's told me a great deal about tonight. I was glad to come." "I imagine she has," Callum said, and there was an edge in it now, thin but unmistakable, the sound of a man realizing the story he'd spent 3 years telling about his ex-wife had just walked into a room full of the very people he'd told it to, and rendered it, instantly, laughably obsolete. Priscilla, for her part, seemed to be recalculating an entirely different set of figures, her gaze moving between Nadia's tailored dress, considerably finer than anything she'd worn during the marriage, and the twins' polished, easy confidence, and Theo's unmistakable presence, with the particular discomfort of a woman who had, Nadia suspected, been told a very specific version of the ex-wife she was about to replace, one that bore no resemblance to the woman actually standing in front of her. "I have to say," Priscilla managed, with a bright, brittle smile, "I didn't expect the children to be here. Colum mentioned you'd moved somewhere upstate, that things were difficult for you after the divorce." "Things were difficult," Nadia agreed, with a calm she'd spent 3 years earning the right to feel, "for about 6 months, while I figured out how to build a life that didn't depend on someone else's approval. I don't regret any of it now. It taught me exactly what I was capable of, which turned out to be considerably more than anyone in this family expected." She glanced, briefly, at Callum, letting the pause stretch just long enough to make the implication land. "I understand the version you were given was probably a good deal less flattering. I'd be happy to correct the record if you'd like details." Priscilla's smile faltered, just slightly, and she glanced toward Callum as though hoping he might rescue the moment, though he seemed, for the first time all evening, entirely at a loss for how. A small crowd had gathered by now, the particular gravity of an unfolding scene drawing guests who pretended to be examining the hors d'oeuvres while listening intently to every word, and Nadia felt, rather than saw, Theo's hand settle a little more firmly at her back. Not possessive, just present. The quiet support of a man who understood exactly what this moment cost her, and had no intention of letting her carry it alone. "I'm glad things worked out for you," Callum said, in the tone of a man trying to reclaim some measure of graciousness before the entire rooftop turned against him, though the attempt landed with considerably less warmth than he'd probably intended. "Truly, and the twins look wonderful. We should arrange more time together, now that things have settled." "They'd like that," Nadia said, and meant it, because whatever her feelings about Callum, she'd never once wanted her children to grow up believing their father's absence was something they'd caused. "Call me next week. We'll set something up that doesn't depend on you remembering 3 years too late." The comment landed exactly as sharply as she'd intended, and she watched Callum absorb it in front of an audience that had, only 20 minutes earlier, been prepared to spend the evening admiring his new fiancée's ring, and was now, instead, quietly reassessing everything they thought they knew about the divorce that had once been the season's most discussed piece of gossip. Later, near the edge of the rooftop with the city spread out gold and glittering beneath them, Theo found her standing alone for a moment while the twins investigated the dessert table with a particular seriousness small children bring to unlimited access to petite fours. "You didn't need me tonight," he said quietly. "You'd have handled all of that exactly the same way without me standing there." "Probably," Nadia admitted. "But I'm glad you were here anyway. not to prove anything to Callum, just because I wanted you to actually meet them, and I wanted them to see what it looks like when someone shows up consistently, instead of hearing about it as a concept. They're extraordinary, Theo said, watching Leo attempt to negotiate a second dessert past a server clearly under instructions to limit the children's sugar intake. Sienna already argued me out of an entire position on renewable energy tax credits in the elevator. I suspect she's going to be considerably more formidable than either of her parents by the time she's 20. God help us all, Nadia said, and laughed. The first easy, unguarded laugh she'd allowed herself all evening, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been braced tight since the invitation first arrived on its expensive cream cardstock. For what it's worth, Theo said, turning to look at her properly, the city lights catching the edge of his expression in a way that made the whole rooftop feel, briefly, considerably smaller than it actually was. I don't think tonight was really about humiliating you at all. Whatever he intended when he sent that invitation. I think he wanted an audience for his own happiness, and instead he got a very clear look at exactly what he gave up, standing right in front of him, entirely unbothered by his attempt to make it small. That's a generous way of putting it. I'm not feeling particularly generous toward him tonight, Theo admitted. I'm feeling considerably more interested in whether you'd let me take you and the twins to dinner properly. Somewhere that isn't haunted by a man who clearly never understood what he had. They'd like that, Nadia said. I'd like that too. They left before the toasts began, mostly because Sienna had reached the specific threshold of tiredness that made further diplomacy inadvisable, and Nadia caught, on the way out, one last glimpse of Callum standing near the bar with Priscilla's hand tight in his expression, caught somewhere between forced composure and the dawning, uncomfortable understanding that whatever story he'd told himself about tonight, the room had walked away with an entirely different one. In the elevator down, Leo leaned against Nadia's side, half asleep already, and Sienna studied Theo with the frank, unfiltered assessment only a 7-year-old could get away with delivering directly to a man's face. Are you going to be around a lot now? She asked. I'd like to be, Theo said, if that's all right with you. Sienna considered this with the gravity of a much older negotiator, glanced once at her mother for confirmation, and apparently found whatever she was looking for in Nadia's expression, because she nodded, satisfied, and leaned her head against Theo's arm the rest of the way down, and Nadia, watching the two of them settle into an easy silence she hadn't dared hope for, thought that whatever Callum had intended when he'd sent that invitation, this, the elevator, the tired children, the quiet man who'd shown up simply because she'd asked him to, was considerably better than anything a rooftop full of gold lettering and expensive cardstock could ever have arranged.